I made mention last week, if you recall, of an article that had been posted by Founders Ministry. The article was entitled "Only Men May Be Pastors." It was written by Tom Hicks, as it turns out, and posted there on November the 7th. And you recall that I said that that particular article had been taken down by Instagram and treated as hate speech by that particular social media outlet. But they have, in fact, apologized for that and restored the article to its proper place. So sometimes pressure works on these sorts of things. Sometimes it doesn't, but that doesn't necessarily change what I said in regards to the fact that we will probably find ourselves more and more on the outs in these particular outlet type of things. But nonetheless, they did the right thing in this particular case. Let me read again the opening line of that article. In spite of the fact that it seems more and more fashionable in our day to say that women may be pastors, the Bible is clear that pastoral leadership is restricted to men, unquote. And I want to put that in front of you as a reminder again, because the entire article was written about the very verses we're going to be looking at this morning. And I did read the article, but I did not follow the article in terms of my substance this morning. Oh, there's a few things I took from it, but the basic outline of the article was theirs. I'm going in a slightly different direction. Once again, let's remind ourselves where we are contextually. It's always important to do that. Where is Paul at in the midst of this letter? Paul has, in chapter 1, outlined a problem in the church at Ephesus. It is a problem specifically related to heterodoxy being taught in the church. And by the time you get to the end of the chapter, you'll notice that Paul addresses two specific men who are problems and have been dismissed from the church for this particular reason. And then as Paul turns into chapter 2, then he begins to outline what he wants the church to be doing. And his main point in chapter 2 is that the church is to be a praying church. It is to be a church that is praying. Its fundamental purpose is to pray for and look for, as a part of that prayer, opportunities to advance the gospel in the world. Paul needs the church to be a praying church, or understands it should be a praying church, because that's what it means to be effective in the place that it's been assigned in the world. And Paul urges the church to pray. The first half of the chapter is nothing more than an urging by Paul for the church to consider this reality, but to do so recognizing that there are going to be different classes of people outside of the church to which we are to preach the gospel. Some of them we might not be inclined to do so. But he wants to be sure that we're preaching to kings and those in authority and so forth. But then he turns his attention back inward to the church to talk about the fact that the church needs to recognize internally its own specific areas of responsibility, particularly in relation to gender and class, these sorts of things. In other words, in order for us to be effective out there in the world, we need to be clear, we understand what our roles are here inside. And the way that Paul will go about doing this is he will distinguish between he will distinguish in a particular class, and that of course is a gender class, between men and women. And he will start by speaking to the men and urging them to lift holy hands without anger or quarreling. And as we speculated, what he probably means is that they are to come together as men, recognizing that no matter what their social differences, cultural differences, class differences might be, that they come together in the church raising holy hands together, pursuing after a life of holiness, pursuing after a life of submissiveness to one another so that they're effective in this role. In other words, leave the class struggles outside and come back into the church as those who are equals, who look upon one another as an opportunity to work together to the advancement of this great goal, the pursuit of the gospel to the world. And then, starting in verse 9, Paul turns his attention to the women. All right, so we started looking at this last week. He addresses them, and that they are to recognize what it means to also be submissive within their role, in this case as members of the female sex. And Paul starts by using here a transition. And he brings first the implications of attire, or what women wear. And the implications of what he's saying is that what women wear demonstrates their position. Many women, Paul would argue, will flaunt their attire in such a way as to demonstrate that they belong in a higher class or in a higher position. Just as he said with the men quarreling and arguing themselves amongst their various positions, women will do it in a much more subtle way, by their clothing, by their attire. So Paul says there's to be no place for that in the church. Women are to come to the church dressed in godliness, dressed with not with outward accoutrements, but with an inward sense of holiness and with a sense of self-control and modesty and so forth. Yes, he does speak to the issue of an outward modesty in terms of dress, but that's not his primary concern. His primary concern isn't what we wear on the outside. The primary concern is what's going on inside as women address themselves in the life of the church. And I think what Paul is arguing between verse 8 and then the women in verse 9 is this simple idea that we are all, regardless of our sex, to come to the church and put aside those extraneous differences which might lead to a sense in which we're not able to totally do the work of preaching the gospel. Which then leads Paul into where he really wants to go with the ladies, okay? Where he really wants to go. And when he comes to verse 11. All right. Now let me read these verses to you as Paul has written them, and then we'll discuss them. Starting in verse 11. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. Here's where Paul is going to go. Paul is going to go into the issue of pastoral leadership. As the article that I read to you a moment ago starts off, the first sentence is this idea of pastoral leadership, the leadership in the church related to the pastoral office. And one of the reasons that we can deduce this is because the entire letter is what we call a pastoral letter. It belongs in the category of those letters that Paul wrote specifically to men who he was training, Philemon, Titus, Timothy, into the role of pastor or elder, teaching elder or shepherd. In other words, the idea is that Paul is writing letters which are specifically designed to help men lead the church effectively. So the issue here that Paul brings up is the issue of leadership. Now that makes sense given what he wrote in chapter 1. Now hold that thought, we'll come back to in a moment. So Paul is clearly articulating here his belief in what pastoral leadership ought to look like in the body. What does it mean for those who are called to lead into pastoral leadership positions? Now, let me just pause and ask a question here. Can we deduce then that this subject that Paul brings up here is related to the heresy that is put in chapter 1? Certainly it's true that Paul is addressing the issue of leadership, and certainly the issue of heresy in chapter 1 is related to issues. So it's possible, given the context of that subject, that Paul is in fact saying, listen, here's what I want to do. I want to talk about women because they belong to this issue of heterodoxy in the church just as much as the men do. You'll notice that only men are mentioned in chapter 1. Alexander and Hymenaeus are the only ones mentioned. So it's possible here that Paul is saying, look, this was a woman problem as much as it is a man problem in the church. That's certainly a possibility. However, it is unlikely, in my opinion, that it was specifically women who were teaching this heterodoxy. They may have been involved, but they were probably not the primary teachers of it. More likely here what Paul is doing, and this is what we all need to catch regardless of what sex you are, that Paul addresses this subject because it is emblematic of a church-wide failure of leadership. A church-wide failure of leadership. So in other words, these words may look like they're written to ladies, but they're really written to men as well, because they belong to the larger class of what it means to have proper leadership in a church. Probably the greatest proof of that is the fact that the very next chapter, the words immediately after this, Paul immediately goes into a discussion of the qualifications of elders and deacons. So it seems reasonable that when Paul here brings this up, he's bringing up the issue of pastoral leadership, not because he wants to say, hey, ladies, stop teaching heterodoxy. What he's saying is, hey, ladies and men, this is a pastoral leadership issue. Let me make sure we understand where this goes, okay? Now that we've set that in motion, let's take a look at what Paul says here. And we already started this issue of how this belongs, so let's now look at each of the verses one by one. The best way to address this is simply to do that, one by one. Verse 11, Paul says, let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. Now this is a transition verse, okay? This is a transition to Paul's main point. But let me pause and point out something if you haven't already figured it out. Look carefully at verse 11. It is obvious that Paul considered the church to be primarily a place of learning. You see it? What does Paul insist that the ladies ought to be doing? Learning. Wouldn't that imply that the church, therefore, is a place of learning, a place where one comes for the purpose of being instructed? Now, let me contradistinct that with the thinking process of so much of the modern American church today. What's the primary goal of most churches now? Is it for the people to gather together for the purpose of learning and being instructed and growing in the understanding of doctrine and Scripture? And the answer is no, a resounding no. In fact, many churches actually brag about the fact that they're not there for teaching and learning, but rather they're there for you to come and have an experience. To come and have an experience. I could not help but laugh out loud when I read the news article that I saw this week about a new version of Monopoly that's been invented. A new version of Monopoly. It's Monopoly for millennials. It's hilarious. No more real estate, because right on the box it says you can't even afford it anyways. So it's not about real estate anymore. It's not about buying properties. Now it's about moving around the board and picking up experience points. Going from experience to experience to experience. And in fact, it used to be that the dollar amounts on the bills were relatively high. Now the dollar bills have been shrunk to 10s and 50s, because the basic idea is you're always broke, but hey, you're having a good time. The millennial mindset, apparently. There was a great deal of offense about that, by the way, on social media. I'm not sure why. But that is, by the way, an encapsulation of much of what's going on in the church of our day. You go to the church in order to have a worship experience. Those words are actually on many of the websites of churches. Come to our church and have a worship experience. It is clear from the Apostle Paul that he intended for the primary activity of the church to be one of learning, of growing and understanding of the Word and its implication for all of life. One of the key words of the New Testament to describe those who belong to Jesus is that they are disciples of Jesus. Not a word we use very often to describe ourselves, but we really probably ought to resurrect that word, right? Disciple. A disciple is a learner. A disciple is a follower of thought. To say that you are a disciple of someone is to say that you are a follower of that person's thought, their understanding of the world. Paul was a disciple of the Rabbi Gamaliel. He followed this man not because he was handsome, but because he had a train of thought that he wanted to follow. To be a disciple is to be someone who learns from another in order to model his ways of thinking and acting. We are disciples of Jesus. That means that we spend our lives learning about this Christ so that we can think like him. Learning about this Christ so we can model his behavior in holiness. Think about what Jesus himself says in Matthew 28, 19 and 20, the Great Commission, right? Go and make disciples of all nations. But don't miss the end of the verse. Teaching them everything that I have said to you. Right? That's the part of what it means to be a disciple. So Paul insists that the proper role for women is to be learning, and to do so in a way that is submissive to that teaching. I could make that argument for men too. The obvious implication of this verse is for all of us gentlemen as well. Being willing to hear, being willing to understand, being willing to apply what is being taught. If you think about it, learning is a submissive activity. It's a submissive activity, isn't it? If you're going to learn, you have to sit under someone who's going to teach, and you have to be willing to actually listen, and you have to be willing to learn and try to understand. That's a submissive thing. Learning, by definition, is submissive. It requires us to put ourselves under someone else. So when Paul says that women should learn quietly with all submissiveness, he is simply transitioning to the thought he wants to get to. This is the principle upon which he will build what is to follow, which comes then to verse 12. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. Now, this is the main point. Here it is. This is the main point that Paul is trying to get to, that women are not, by God's designed, to be the pastoral leaders in the church. They are not to be the ones providing the primary instruction of the congregation. Now, this verse, of course, is quickly and instantly objected to by all who hold to a more egalitarian or, dare I say, feminist position. So let's ask a few questions about this verse. First question, is this Paul's opinion? Is this just Paul's opinion? Or is this a more general rule? I mean, after all, Paul says, I do not, right? So by first implication, we might say, well, it's just Paul's opinion. All right, let's ask that question. Those who are egalitarians, then, those who believe in a more uniform sense of role in the church, would argue a couple of things in regards here. Number one of the first arguments that I've ever heard in regards to explaining this by egalitarians was this. Well, the so-called pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, they weren't really written by Paul anyways. In fact, every single liberal seminary in America teaches that thought, and very many evangelical seminaries teach that same thought as well. That these letters were written later by someone else who used Paul's name. They were not written by the apostle himself. They couldn't have been written by the apostle himself. Just doesn't make sense. And so therefore, the authority of these letters is greatly diminished. I mean, after all, if it was written by some pseudo-anonymous writer 100 years after Paul died, then what possible authority could they have in our lives? The problem, of course, with that is very simply this. There's little evidence to support the claim. It's simply a claim. But it doesn't have any support. And one of the largest and most consistent problems with it is that the early church accepted and embraced these letters. They were in place in the canon of Scripture long before the 3rd century or 4th century. Long before then. In order for them to have been so, it's highly likely that they were written by the apostle himself. And church tradition has held that to be the case for many, many centuries. It's only been in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries that the authority of the pastoral epistles has started to be questioned. But that seems reasonable, doesn't it? When societies began to embrace a more enlightened view of men and women and gender roles, it became obvious that these letters needed to be dismissed. So what do? You come up with a theory as the best way to get rid of them. The other problem, of course, is, well, if you dismiss these letters as authority, then what else in Paul's writings are you ready to dismiss? Secondly, the second argument that's made by the egalitarians is, well, since Paul says, I do not permit, it is obvious that this was only his opinion in practice. Here's the problem with that, though. If that is true, if Paul says, I do not permit, then what we have to ask ourselves is, what does he base his reasoning on? What does he base his opinion on? If Paul really believed that this was just his opinion, then he would have stopped at this point and said, you know what, I don't permit women to teach in the church. I don't think you should either. End of sentence, and nothing else. But he doesn't. You will notice that as I read through the verses and got to verses 13 and 14, that Paul actually appeals scripturally to his position. He doesn't make an opinion based on simply his experience. He makes an opinion based on his observation and exegesis of Scripture, specifically Genesis chapter 1 to 3, which we'll come back to in a moment. So I think there's, number one, very little evidence to suggest that you can just discard Timothy in order to get rid of the verse. And then secondly, that you can look at this and say, well, it's just Paul's opinion. The fact is, everything Paul wrote in his letters was his opinion, was it not? I mean, by definition, it was his opinion. But it was his opinion inspired by the Spirit of God, not only through the revelation that he'd received in Christ and the working of the Spirit in him, but many other things as well. I believe that what Paul is doing in this verse is this. He is simply exercising his apostolic authority. That Paul's simply standing up and saying, I, as an apostle, do not permit this. This is inappropriate from an apostolic perspective. Just as he will use that authority to establish the qualifications of pastoral leadership in chapter 3, seems reasonable that what he's saying here, that he does not permit women from holding the teaching office or standing in authority over the church, would come from his own position as an apostle, don't you think? I mean, Paul is writing apostolically to Timothy and saying to him, I am your father in the faith. Therefore, I wish to speak authoritatively to you. So when Paul writes to Timothy and says, I do not permit a woman to teach, he's simply appealing to the same authority that he's used all along. So that leads me to a second question. If it's not just his opinion, how is the issue of teaching connected to the issue of exercising authority? Notice how he puts it. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Those look like two different things, don't they? Because the word or is a separator which creates two distinct realities. Couldn't Paul, or couldn't we say then, or the Egalitarians say, couldn't women serve as teachers even if they weren't acting in the role of elder? All right, so let's address semantically what he's saying. Step back from the position of an elder, or say an apostle, someone with authority. Step back from the position and notice that by definition, each of those roles is primarily a teaching role. Is it not? The office of elder and the office of apostle were specifically designed to be the teaching roles in the church. It's by definition that a case. And they're intricately connected together. In fact, go down to chapter 3. As Paul speaks of elders, one of the most significant qualifications that he adds to it is apt to teach. Or, as I will argue later, and having an ability and desire to do so. So the idea is that there's a connection between the office of authority, apostle or elder, and the function thereof, which is to teach. And it would be fair to say then that someone who teaches intrinsically becomes an authority over someone else. When you're teaching, you're standing and exercising the teaching office and teaching something, are you not, by definition, exercising authority over someone else? I'm expecting you to listen and to learn and to be submissive. Every school teacher will tell you that in her position, in his position as a teacher, the goal is to exercise authority in what you are teaching. When the student says, well, you say 2 + 2 = 4, but I think it means 5, the teacher says, yeah, but I'm the teacher. Therefore, it means 4, not 5. There's authority there, correct? So Paul connects the two things together because they are inherently the same. You cannot separate teaching from authority. You cannot. especially from a biblical perspective, a New Testament perspective, in which what's being taught is the very essence of the faith itself. And we're not talking here, I'm sorry, Christy, but we're not just talking about teaching 2 + 2 = 4. We're talking about life and death matters of eternity. So we're teaching those things that are fundamental to the very existence of a person. So when Paul says teaching that's being done in the church has that level of importance, by definition, it has a higher level of authority in it. So there's no way to distinguish between the two. When Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority, he's basically using two terms that are synonymous: teaching and exercising authority together. You will notice, by the way, that what happened in the liberal churches, amongst the more egalitarian denominations of the Christian church in America, is that once the office of teaching was opened to women, it became only a matter of time before they were allowed to be pastors. That's all it took. All they had to do was open the door for the opportunity for women to then stand in the position of authority, and there was no stopping the domino effect of them becoming pastors. Paul recognizes that connection, and so do we. Which leads then to the third question. Does this imply then that women are never allowed to teach in any other capacity? Is Paul suggesting here that women are never to teach in any capacity at all? And the answer is a resounding no. You'll notice that Paul puts the phrase over a man in the phrase. I do not permit women to teach or to exercise authority over a man. If he intended for women to never teach at all, the phrase wouldn't have to be there. But by virtue of including that, what he does is he limits this particular situation to a pastoral teaching issue. In fact, all you got to do is go to one of the other pastoral epistles, Titus chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Paul will specifically in that letter instruct the older women of the church to take the lead in teaching the younger women of the church. So if Paul didn't believe that women were never to teach, then his instructions in Titus 2 would have been contradictory to his own position. No, what Paul believes, and what he's speaking of here, is specifically the issue of the relationship between women and men, the pastoral leadership, the pastoral teaching responsibility in the church. Paul believes that although women will have important teaching roles in the church, this does not include the primary teaching role of elder. Which leads then to a fourth question. Does this imply that women cannot take leadership over men outside of the church? Now, this is one that Paul doesn't really address. Now, I know it's used as a canard by many of the egalitarians who would argue that, well, look, if you're going to allow women to take leadership outside of the church, then you have to allow women to have leadership inside of the church. But that's a canard. That's a logical fallacy. One does not necessarily equate with the other. Complementarians have struggled with this for a long time. I, for example, sat under a woman that I respected very much in my time at Bethel College, Bethel University, as I got my degree there. She was my primary, I don't even know what you'd call her, I guess, mentor, I guess, what you would call her. At the school, I respected her deeply. Ironically, she was a very strong egalitarian. Believed that women should be elders in the church, and we disagreed on that particular point. Had a number of debates about that. I was her TA. I did some grading work for her and some teaching work for her, in fact, at the school. And I submitted myself to her authority in that environment. But it's not a church. It wasn't a church. As I said, there's been much debate about this amongst complementarians. So my opinion on the subject, and it can only be this, is that these instructions are specifically being written about life in the church itself. Life in the church herself. Thus, there is real doubt as to whether these can apply to secular life, even amongst believers in so-called religious organizations. We'll allow each individual organization to make a decision outside of the walls of the church, parachurch organizations or religious organizations, to make these kind of decisions as to how much they want to embrace a complementarianism within that environment. But Paul here is clearly writing to a church, And he's clearly writing to people who are sitting under apostolic and elder authority. So he's not just writing to willy-nilly secular organizations out there. Which leads then to question number 5, and this is the one again that egalitarians point at. Well, what does it mean then for women to remain quiet, right? Rather, she is to remain quiet. Does this imply that women must never speak in the church at all? Waiting for my answer, aren't you? Now, how many of you think that's remotely reasonable? It's not, is it? There's no way in the world that Paul would be writing here and say, okay, ladies, when you come to the church, as soon as you get to the front door, at that point you are to be mute and not say a word the entire time you're in the church. That's ridiculous. Now, here's what's happened. Okay, the reason I bring up the question is because there's egalitarians who will look at this verse and say, well, look, Paul is so whack that what he's doing is suggesting that all women should walk into the church and remain mute the entire time that they're there. Well, that's preposterous. The context gives us an idea of what Paul is talking about. What is Paul talking? Is Paul talking about just general conversation that you're supposed to have in the church? Or is he talking specifically about the idea of standing and teaching and leading others and having authority over them in the teaching office? The answer is obviously the latter. And so he's talking specifically about the specific idea of a woman standing up and speaking in the context of teaching. And specifically in the context of teaching the larger congregation that has both men and women in it. So the remain quiet isn't just shut up and not say anything. The remain quiet is do not take on the role of stepping up and becoming a teacher over men in the church. Paul elaborates on this more in 1 Corinthians 14. When he says these words, as in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches. Okay, so he kind of says the same thing, right? So it's obvious from 2 different letters of the Apostle Paul. By the way, 1 Corinthians is never treated as unauthoritative from Paul. And yet they ignore this verse. Okay? For they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Now, Paul's not suggesting it's shameful for you to have a conversation in the kitchen with other women, or to come into the sanctuary and raise your voices in song, or to speak in the congregational reading. He's certainly not suggesting that. The context here, Paul says, is the context of orderly worship. You read chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians, it's obvious that Paul is talking about how the worship service is to be conducted. The particular problem in the Corinthian church was the whole issue of speaking in tongues and interpretations and all these kinds of things. And Paul is saying, listen, you have to be clear here that we understand how this should be done. Women should not be involved in prophecy or interpretation of prophecy. They should not be a part of the teaching ministry of the main activity of the church. Again, it's hyperbole for egalitarians to interpret this as Paul wants all women to be silent all the time. Thus, we can dismiss this verse as illogical and stupid. No. Paul is arguing for silence in the sense of the teaching office itself, not just in a general sense. So here's what Paul is doing in this verse. Paul instructs the church that its primary teaching leadership is to be composed of men, and that women are to submit themselves to this leadership and not assume that position. Again, he's instructing the church that its primary teaching leadership, the preaching office, the elder office, is to be composed of men, and that women are to submit themselves to this leadership and not assume that position. And then in verses 13 and 14, Paul will give 2 reasons for this. Paul is not simply going to lay down a principle and then walk away from it. Rather, he's going to go to the scriptures and he's going to give 2 reasons for this to be so. Verse 13. For Adam was formed first than Eve. Notice the for, so it gives you, here's why. For this reason, okay? So here's what he says. In verse 13, he says that Adam was formed first than Eve, meaning that God designed the man to lead by virtue of his created order. By the way, this verse and 2 Corinthians 11:3 are the only historical references to Eve in the New Testament. The only historical references to Eve at all in the New Testament. And in both cases, Paul mentions the fact that she was deceived. Hold that thought. Now, let's think about what took place in Genesis 1 and 2 in regards to the creation of the woman. We talked about this a little bit last week, right? Adam was found in a situation where he was alone, meaning there was no other human being for him to relate to. He was not alone by virtue of the fact that God was there. But God, in his infinite wisdom, understood this concept of relationship on a peer-to-peer level, because the Father, Son, and the Spirit have a perfect peer-to-peer relationship and always have had. And so when God looks upon Adam, what he sees is a man who does not have a peer. He does not have a complement. And so God says it's not good for him to be alone, and it's certainly not possible for him to be fruitful and multiply without this complement. So what I'm going to do is create the complement. I'm going to create another human being. I'm not going to form it from the dust of the ground, but rather from his side. And I'm going to do this and bring this woman to him in order to complete him, to complement him. Now, this does not imply, as many would assume, that because God looks upon Adam and says, well, Adam is alone, so he needs another, that the woman he creates would be his utter equal. Does it? Now, for many it does, but not from the perspective of Genesis 2. It's a complement to him. What he needs is completed in Eve, but God did not create another Adam. And the specific thing to keep in mind here is that God did not create Eve so that she would now, as his absolute equal, also serve in the same roles that Adam himself would have. He would not establish Eve to also be the one who would represent the entirety of a people. In Romans chapter 5, Paul makes a very big deal about this when he brings up Adam as the federal head of the human race. He never mentions Eve, by the way, in that passage. Adam is treated as the federal head of the human race. It is Adam who is the one who represented the race in his disobedience. It is Adam who introduced death into the world, Paul says. It is Adam who's the one who brings all of the ramifications of original sin, including original guilt and original pollution, into the human race. Eve is never mentioned having been involved in that because that was his role, his duty, his position. Establish that. Nowhere does the Bible intimate that Eve was granted specifically that particular thing. And Jesus, you remember, is depicted as a second Adam or a last Adam in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15, correlating to Adam, not Eve. Not Eve. And in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16, you recall, Eve is specifically subjected to Adam as a part of her curse. Just as her desire would be for him, or the Hebrew can also be translated against him, he would rule over her. God specifically and explicitly said to the woman, you will have a desire for your husband. This desire will be such that your desire will even be against him, in the sense that you will have a desire to rule over him, but he will rule over you. Paul contends then that this creation order itself argues for male headship in the church. That the order of establishing the roles between the sexes is based not upon the fact that both are simply human, but rather upon the God-ordained order established in the creation itself. Paul says, look, if you just look at Genesis chapter 2, what you get is a picture of a man who has responsibilities. He's been given a certain role. He needs a complement in order to complete that role. That's true. But ultimately, he stands responsible in his role for that, and therefore it continues in its way through creation, and specifically into the church. But I would have you to think of one other thing in this regard. Paul doesn't mention this here, but it's clearly implied. You remember in chapter 5 of the book of Ephesians, Paul makes an argument, or Paul makes a connection, or correlation, if you will, between the marriage relationship that's established in Genesis 2 as the very foundation of the church itself, doesn't he? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Notice the parallel that Paul makes. Paul makes a connection between marriage itself, what God did in forming Eve and bringing Eve to Adam, and says this is a picture of the very essence of the church herself. You could make a very good argument here, it's not even an argument, it's an obvious fact, that the church is therefore a family. It's treated in the same context of family. In fact, Jesus himself is spoken of as the elder brother of many brothers and sisters, as those who are adopted into this family and belong to this Christ. We are brothers and sisters of our elder brother who is Christ himself. In Romans, Paul speaks of the idea that Jesus is the firstborn of many brothers. He's the first one out of the grave, in anticipation of all the others who will come out of the grave, who will be the brothers and sisters of this Jesus. The church is a family. We're brothers and sisters in Christ. But the implication of Ephesians 5, and what can also be drawn here, is that Paul says that just as a family in the home is to be led by the husband, so the family of the church is to be led by a man. The implication of this is strong. I realize that in our society today, everybody thinks it's just fine to have households that are headed by women with no man around. It's become a common idea. But all the anecdotal and statistical evidence that's ever been collected suggests that's not really the best way to run families, is it? The fact of the matter is that families are best when there is a man at the helm who is leading under a direct submissiveness to Christ himself, right? A man who has the best interests of his wife and his family by virtue of being absolutely committed and submitted to this Christ. That's Ephesians 5. That's the picture that's being painted here. The creation order itself cries out for the idea that the head of the church, the pastoral leadership, is to be that of a man. Which leads to verse 14. This is a verse I really don't want to preach. And I'm going to remind you from the outset, please do not shoot the messenger. Okay? Let me read for you a couple of quotes. The first one of these comes from Wayne Grudem. You know him and his systematic theology. In his book, Evangelical Feminism and Biblical Truth, he says this: "This is by far the most common viewpoint in the history of the interpretation of this passage." In other words, what I'm about to tell you, the interpretation of this passage, is, in his opinion, the most common interpretation of this verse. All right, now let me read to you from Dan Doriani, A History of the Interpretation of 1 Timothy, chapter 2. Quote, "Both sides," that is, both feminists and traditionalists, both egalitarians and complementarians, "note women tend toward enmeshment, which entails an unwillingness to see and condemn harsh truths about loved ones. Enmeshment is the idea of someone being so enmeshed in the life of another that they struggle to see the faults and the failures of another. Mindful of many individual exceptions to the rule, okay, they, both feminists and traditionalists, sometimes say that women generally have more interest in persons and less interest in detached, rational analysis of ideas." Or to interpret what he just said, women are more inclined to the emotional realities of life, where men are more inclined to the intellectual realities of life. But the capacity for detached critical assessment is absolutely essential for discerning and rooting out heresy, for carrying out discipline in the church. So you hear what he just said. Okay, I just gave you the interpretation. The interpretation is this: that men as a class are by constitution more fitted to teach and have authority. Okay, I'm just telling you what I think Paul is saying here and what most interpreters across time have suggested that Paul is arguing here. When Paul says, for Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor, the natural question is why does Paul bring up the deception? Why was Eve deceived? And the answer from Paul, here and elsewhere, by the way, in his writings, is that Eve was deceived because she looked at the tree and she made an analysis of it on an emotional basis and a connection rather than an intellectual and logical one. I mean, you can read the story itself in Genesis 3 and see some of that. I won't spend a lot of time at it to not belabor the point, but one of the reasons it says that she took the fruit and ate it was because she saw that it looked pleasing and tasty. Was that a rational, logical argument, or was that more of an emotional enmeshment article? It's more of an enmeshment article. Now again, notice that this is, obviously, if you say this in front of a room full of egalitarians, you're going to get killed. But the idea is that the egalitarian would argue that there's no fundamental difference between men and women. I mean, is that not the position that's being pressed upon us today? In every sense. The transgender movement is exactly doing that. It's ripping away any sense of difference between men and women. So now it doesn't matter. You can be X. It doesn't matter. You don't have to be male or female. There's no difference between the two, right? That means that men can join women in their bicycle races and it shouldn't matter. Women should be able to beat them just as, but we know it's preposterous. But that's where egalitarians want to go. What they want is to say that not only are the roles the same, but the very constitution is the same as well. So they're destroying the very essence of feminism itself. Femininity itself is being destroyed. Now, I would argue that masculinity is being destroyed as well in the process, so we're all going to wind up being this mash of nothingness at some point, which will not survive. It will not survive. So the idea that Paul brings here is the position that the fact is that there's a difference of constitution. And Paul argues that difference of constitution is something that should be considered when you put a woman into a position of leadership. Because the reality is that a woman is going to deal with issues related to heresy, issues related to heterodoxy in the church, i.e. chapter 1, very differently than men are. And it's going to be more difficult, Paul argues, for women to take and bring discipline into the church where needed. The enmeshment that they're going to have is going to make it difficult for them to deal with these matters. So it's best not to put them into such positions. I'll give you an example. You probably heard of this. How many times have you seen it that a woman who's being abused by a man will go back to that man again and again and again? Why? What causes a woman to think, yes, I still want to be with this man even though he beats me. I want to be with this man. Why? That's it. It's a constitutional reality, a psychological, physiological, and emotional reality in women. And it's been documented many times in many different ways. Now, I realize it's not easy to hear, but that's the way it is. And one of the side effects of this egalitarianism now is to believe that the pastoral office isn't about rational teaching and shepherding along the lines of intellect, but rather simply about emotional support. The primary job of a pastor in many churches that have been feminized in America is that the primary job of a pastor is to provide the people with emotional support. His number one job is to make sure that everybody's comfortable, that all the needs are being met emotionally. Now, there's a place for that, and there's certainly opportunity to do that, but it's not the primary job. What is the primary job of the elder? To teach, to lead you and me into learning, to understanding what it is that this word says. We were talking about this morning. We were talking about the will of God. We're talking about this idea that one of the problems that we have today is we're so in love with this idea of trying to discover what the Word of God, what the will of God is for ourselves. We become so tuned inwardly that we fail to see outwardly what it is that God is doing in the world as a whole. And the same problem occurs. We struggle to get away from our particular personal problems because we don't have the bigger picture. Paul is concerned that the pastoral leadership of the church be leading the church in sound doctrine. It's a key issue in the book, isn't it? And therefore, it is better then that women not be engaged in that due to their psychological makeup. But then Paul gives some good news in verse 15. So he says, okay, I've said that, but let me just say, yet, all right, so let me make sure that you don't get completely offended here. She says, yet she will be saved through childbearing. Now again, this difficult verse, but it isn't that hard. Paul obviously here is not saying that women will be saved from the wrath of God by having children. Okay? He's not saying that. Okay, this word saved here doesn't have to be in a salvific sense of going to heaven when you die. That's not what he means. He's being saved through something. The word saved in this case is being kept safe through. Okay? But it has an even greater sense in this. Finding the fullest sense of fulfillment in and through. Why was Eve formed? Because Adam could not make babies. It wasn't going to happen. And God knew it. And so what did he create? He created the complement to him that would then become the instrument through which this be fruitful and multiply would happen. And so it was the woman who was granted the wonderful privilege of being able to carry and deliver and nurse a child. Something a man will never be able to do, no matter how much science really tries to make it happen. The fact is that this is not being rescued from the wrath of God. It's not surviving the act of childbirth, but it's finding the fullness of safety in those things for which the female gender was originally created. The opportunity to discover the fullness and fulfillment of what comes in being a woman. See, our problem today, look, the problem today is there's a lot of women who think, I will never be fulfilled unless I can do what men do. You don't hear men talk like that very much, do you? Women are saying, well, I want to do what a man could do. Well, the fact is there's a whole lot of us men who really under our breath are thinking, yeah, I'd really like to be able to do what women do, but I'm never going to have that opportunity. The fact is that what Paul is saying here is that the very act of childbearing itself, which is uniquely woman, is something that God has granted to you as the female sex. And it is through this that you find fulfillment in doing what it means to be a woman. Now, I understand that there are some of you who haven't had children. I get it. But that doesn't mean that you won't find fulfillment as a woman just because you haven't had a child. Many of you are sisters or aunts or stepmothers or whatever. You can still, in all of those roles as females, discover the joy of fulfilling the wondrous role of any of those things, right? That a man can never do. I mean, if the argument of the previous verse is that women have a natural sense of enmeshment, then that shouldn't be a drag upon you, but rather a blessing. What can you do with that? And the answer is you can do things that us men stand around and look stupid trying to do, because you have a natural ability that we do not necessarily possess. So what Paul is saying is, listen, you'll be saved through childbearing. You'll be saved through the role of what it means to be a woman. You will find your fulfillment. You will find your sense of purpose and reality, not in trying to be what men are, but trying to be what women are. Trying to do what women do. And as he says at the end of the verse, if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. And by the way, the switch of pronoun there from first person to third person, or second person to third person, indicates that Paul is raising the level here, raising the level of principality here. Here's where I'm going. This isn't just about certain women who want to be in leadership roles. This is about all women in general. And by the way, that connects back, if you'll notice, all the way back to verse 10. It becomes a bookend to verse 10. Living a life of godliness, living a life of holiness, living a life of love and faith and self-control. Those are the things that God is really looking for. He's not looking for you to somehow find your fulfillment in being able to be ordained to the office of elder and teach. God has given to you an opportunity to serve Him in a magnificent way because you're female. He created you that way. I think that transgenderism is the greatest rebellion of God that we've seen in the 21st century. To shake your fist at God and say, I will not be the very sex you have given me because I want to be the other one. It's preposterous. God has said, I created you lovingly and beautifully as a woman or as a man. And I've established each of you with responsibilities and opportunities within that sex. And as believers, as followers of Christ, we should be saying to ourselves, how can I live out this God-given gift of sex? What can I do with it? Now, notice how this connects back to the beginning. Paul believes that the greatest thing a woman could do is to use the gifts of femininity in the way that God Himself designed at the very foundation of the world. And not to covet the masculine gifts as though exercising them will bring fulfillment and purpose. But notice how this connects to the whole issue of prayer. You'll notice that all 6 of these sermons from chapter 2 had the same title, the need for prayer. Because that's what Paul is telling the church to do. There's an opportunity here to be an effective praying church. Both sexes, men and women, in their designated role in the gender that they've been given, need to understand their place within it. Not attempting to quarrel or dress their way into positions of power, but to be submissive to the God-ordained order of things. In other words, putting the best interest of the church first. In all things. As a man, we are to put the best interest of the church first. What are we to do? We're to leave those class distinctions at the door. We're to come into this place and say, it doesn't matter how much money I make per year or where I live. It doesn't matter any of those things. What matters is that we come together as a group of men. We come down on our knees, lifting holy hands before this God, one to another as peers, because that's what it's going to take to make an effective church preaching the gospel to kings and others in authority. And then he turns to the women and says, and for you, it's not about how you dress. It's not about you trying to become elders in the church, but it's by you using the God-ordained gifts that He has given you to join hands with one another as you mutually submit to one another and as you work together towards the advancement of the gospel using the gifts of femininity that God has given to you. See where Paul goes here? Paul says you got to have a right gender view. You got to understand why there's this distinction. God has made it on purpose. God has purpose for us to be of different genders and have different roles in those genders because He knows that it's the complement of all those things together that will make His church successful. So there are some things in the church that men are called to do, and they're to do them well as men who pray together, and then there are those things that women are called to do, and they are to do so well as they also pray together. See it? This is remarkable thinking from the apostle. He's not concerned with how to solve heterodoxy by simply running in and saying, look, just put some people in charge, form a committee, and go root out the heterodoxy. No, what Paul says is everybody needs to step back for a second, recognize what their role is to be, and do it to the best interest of the church. That's remarkable. It's not where I would have gone. But the Spirit of God led him to go there. So let us think, men and women, both of us, let us think about what our role is to be and why. Why has God set us aside to these things that we might find the fullness of our fulfillment? Not in chasing after that which is not ours, but chasing that which is truly